Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, continuing our book series. Again, I'm the Associate Director of Community Engagement, and I teach in the Chicano Studies, Central American Studies, and African American Studies department. Today, we have Abigail Saguy. Hello, Abigail. How are you today?
I'm wonderful, thank you.
Wonderful. So we're going to review her book today entitled Come Out, Whoever You Are. And she's written this along with former graduate students that include Laura Enriquez, Nicole Iturraga, and Michael Stambolis Rustafer. All right, so let's get started. Abigail, can you please tell us the genesis of this book? Can you please tell us how you came to research this specific topic?
So I actually started the germ, the little seed that planted this book actually originated in the summer of 2001 when I was doing research for my second book, so the book before this one, which was about fat politics, debates over body size, public health debates, and also identity politics over body size. And I was at the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance Convention, and I was interviewing mostly women, some men, about how they had gotten involved in the fat acceptance movement. And I was struck by the language I was hearing again and again. People would say to me, "Let me tell you about how I came out as a fat person." Or I was a closeted fat person until this moment, and then I came out as fat. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I never would have thought of people coming out as fat. And why are they using this particular language? What is this language accomplishing? And so it was tickling. It was in the back of my mind, and I continued to think about this. But I went on and I did that other book, published a book with Oxford University Press in 2013, What's Wrong with Fat? But I couldn't leave it alone. And so I went back, and with a former graduate student in gender studies, Anna Ward, together we wrote an article about coming out as fat. And in this article, we wrote about why fat acceptance activists are talking about coming out as fat. What is it accomplishing? And we learned some, I had, from the interviews that I had done with these activists, learned some really interesting things. First of all, that this was really accomplishing something important, in that just by using the language of coming out, the fat acceptance movement was making an analogy, as social movements often do, and to say being fat is stigmatized. It's something you're born with. In many ways, it's very much like being born fat is very much like being born gay. It's like a sexual orientation. So that was interesting. And the other thing that really came out of that early research was the way that intersectional identities were allowing for the spread of social movement tactics. So I found out through my interviews that some of the earliest people to talk about coming out as fat were fat, queer women who had also experienced coming out as queer or lesbian and knew that very intimately, and said, there's something similar going on with my fat identity. And then after that, it got picked up by others, by straight fat people, by others, as something that resonated with them. And so then later, this continued to be an interest, and I spoke to several of my graduate students, and they were seeing similar things happening in other contexts. And so Laura Enriquez spoke to me about the undocumented movement and how we were seeing something very similar there, where the undocumented movement was talking about coming out as undocumented and unafraid. And there too, it was people who were undocumented and queer who were seeing these similarities and helping this tactic spread. And then with Nicole Iraga had done research as part of her senior thesis at UC Berkeley on Mormon fundamentalist polygamists, and had told me, they're also using this language of coming out. And that seemed to be very puzzling, because this is a movement that, a group that is very conservative politically, and yet they're using this language. They're associating themselves with a group that they disapprove of, because they do not, the Mormon fundamentalists do not approve of homosexuality, of same-sex desire, and yet they're still using this language that links them. And so, that became a puzzle to unfold. And so, with collaborations with several students over several years, we did a series of interviews, over 100 interviews with these different groups of people. And from that emerged the book in a nutshell. It's a little bit longer story than that, but that's a somewhat concise recounting of it.
That's wonderful. You've done a really great job to explain, and I think that's one of the fruits and contributions of the book, as how this rhetoric that once began with the LGBTQ movement moves into other spaces. So given all of it, what is the main argument of the book? What do you wish the reader to come really thinking about with all of the data that you provide?
Yeah, so the argument really follows from the question. So the question of the book was, why and how are people using this language? And the why speaks to the fact that the LGBTQ rights movement has been incredibly successful in a relatively short period of time, and that the politics of coming out have been very powerful. And so part of the argument is that this language and this analogy and talk of coming out is being used by so many groups because it has proven so successful and so powerful in the LGBTQ context, and that by using this language is very powerful in that it connects, it links these different movements to another group for which there's been a lot of progress in terms of public opinion. There's still more to be done, but we've really seen a big shift in terms of support for the LGBTQ community in a relatively short period of time. And this coming out, the politics of coming out is viewed by many as a large piece of that success. So it's not surprising, and I think that helps us understand why people are using this language. And then the other part of the argument is what we were just discussing, it relates to what we were discussing a moment ago, has to do with these intersectional identities and the process or the mechanism through which social movement strategies and tactics are spreading across different movements. So the role of that people play with these intersectional identities, people who have membership in more than one group, who go through the world not just as gay or LGBTQ, one of those letters applies to them, but also they're also fat, or they're also undocumented, and they can take these experiences from one context to another. That's important. Now there are some wrinkles in that, so there's some surprises in the book, and one of the surprises I alluded to a moment ago is this Mormon fundamentalist case, which is in many ways is the case that's not like the others. I mean, each is different and similar, which is what I think is part of what makes the book interesting. But the Mormon fundamentalists are a case in which people do not have overlapping memberships, right? None of the people we interviewed who identify as Mormon fundamentalists, polygamists, also identify as LGBTQ, none of them. The closest we had is one person who had a cousin whom they had some connection to, and yet they're using this language, right? So that was one of the puzzles that Nicole and I were, working through in that part of the book. And there, what's interesting is the way these two issues get connected through kind of a network of issues as opposed to networks of people. So when former Supreme Justice Antonin Scalia talks about same-sex marriage being a slippery slope, And if we legalize same-sex marriage, before we know it, we'll have polygamy legalized. You know, that's a way that people are connecting these issues. And that, in fact, is what happened in the case of polygamy, is that the issue of same-sex marriage and polygamy were linked by, among others, conservatives, right, who were using this as an argument to defeat marriage equality, but ironically actually helped the plural marriage rights activists promote their claims about the rights of plural marriage families or polygamous families.
So that is definitely one of the gems in the books, as you just spoke to us about how this coming out rhetoric travels through social movements and the power and the politics of that. Can you kind of take us through maybe a specific a group or strategy? I know that you include the Me Too movement, which is a critical and very important movement. And kind of take us through how the rhetoric of coming out allows them to gain recognition and social change.
Yes. So the case of the Me Too movement is interesting for many reasons. One is it was not one of the original cases in the book. It actually emerged in response to an anonymous reviewer from Oxford University Press who had seen the earlier version of the book and said, gosh, you know, it was right. It was being reviewed. I actually wrote the first draft before the Me Too movement happened. And so it was being reviewed while the Me Too movement, or at least while it was going viral, right after Toronto Burke's Me Too movement had been in effect for a decade, but before the viral movement that we saw happen in 2016. And so it was the anonymous reviewer who said, you know, there seems to be something similar happening with the Me Too movement. Isn't this a kind of coming out? And this was very fortuitous for me because my very first book was about sexual harassment and how and why it's been defined differently in the US and France. And so I thought, great, an opportunity to come full circle and bring that back in. And so, you know, so that movement is engaging in some of the same politics, not just of coming out, but also of outing. And that was really what became very interesting for me in that chapter, because if you go back and look at the history of the LGBTQ movement, which chapter 2 with Michael Stambalis Rustopher does, that we see there's a progression over time in the movement. And the final phase and the most controversial is this politics of outing. And that was always very controversial because outing is a very painful thing, and people in the LGBT community have often experienced that, and that's a painful thing for them. So to do it to someone else, even if that person you're outing was a conservative who was proposing legislation contrary to the interests of LGBTQ people, was being hypocritical, these were the contexts in which people were being outed. Even so, there was a lot of controversy around that. And with the Me Too movement also, right? What we were seeing happening in the Me Too movement was the outing of people who had been assaulting, had been harassing, and there were a lot of questions that came up about that. Were whisper networks appropriate? And so one of the whisper networks that got the most attention was the Shitty Media Men list that you may remember. And it began as a list that was just being shared among women working in the industry, in the news media. And it was being used as a way to protect other women, to inform other women, you might want to be careful with this one. This one is bad news, right? But then the list went public, and then some men lost their jobs, and people started saying, there's no due process, and you can't do this, and what's your proof? And so these are the questions that we're still struggling with today. And I think that chapter really highlights these issues.
Absolutely. These are very critical issues in these times. So, given all of this that you've put out in this book, can you tell us how these collective mobilizations, what do they have to say to the current events happening today, the controversies around health and COVID, specifically the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of strategies, tactics, as you spoke about in length, the importance of intersectionality and possible coalition building?
Yes, absolutely. Well, just to take a step back, I think one of the main takeaways or the main points of this book is really the effect of stigma and on a variety of different groups. And often when we're talking about social movements or we're talking about different types of discrimination, we tend to compartmentalize. And so we're not sufficiently intersectional. This is something that scholars, as well as lawyers, as well as policymakers struggle with, and it can be challenging to keep in mind all of the relevant intersections. And we, when we tend to think of these different issues and movements in isolation. And so I think one of the takeaways of this book, or the contributions of the book, is to take a step back and to think about what's universal. And I think the experience of stigma is universal. Irving Goffman, who is the sociologist who really developed this concept of stigma the way we use it today, talked about people who were stigmatized and people who were not stigmatized, and the people who were not stigmatized were the normals. And he said, basically, nobody is in that category, right? Everyone has some stigma, whether it's visible or it's classic. We all struggle that, and I struggle with that. And I think that is really important to keep in mind today. It's important to remember the differences. We have different experiences, and to have a lot of humility and to understand that we don't understand what other people are going through a lot of the time, but to also at the same time keep in mind our common humanity, and I that we are all also, people want to be accepted, they want to be loved. These kind of human traits run across. So those are some things.
Thank you, Abigail. So in conclusion, can you give us any final thoughts, or, why should someone pick up this book, or a professor should assign it for a class?
So I think this book would be a great tool for a variety of different classes. It's a book that really speaks not only to stigma and the experience of stigma from a variety of different sources, but also destigmatization strategies. The talk of coming out is one, I argue in the book, is a destigmatization strategy. It's a way of responding to stigma that operates at both an individual level and a collective level. And as such, it's powerful. So I think in any class where you want to be talking about how do people resist messages that they are lesser than, how do they resist and rebel against policies that deny them full rights, how do strategies of destigmatization and claiming rights function, and how do these strategies move across different social movements. This is a book that will address that. It's also a great book for signing in classes in that it's one book, but it's addressing so many different issues. And so I think, that you could use it to get into lots of different topics and show some common themes across them.
Absolutely. And again, this is a great reflection of the cutting edge work that is being done at UCLA. Please pick up this book or sign it in your class. The students will gain so much, especially in these times around social movements and ways of, as Abigail was speaking to, strategies of resistance. I'd like to thank Abigail again for giving us your time today. Thank you so much. And this is Celia Lacayo signing off. Please remember to subscribe to LA Social Science.